Hello, welcome to another podcast episode on Talk Architecture. And I'm your host, Naziati Muhammad Yaqub, and I'll be discussing in a monologue what makes a good studio master. And this is for any studio, may it be the first year, the second year, third year, fourth year, and fifth year. This in keeping with the trend or the situation out there. We have the first degree 3 years and the second degree or the master's degree 2 years. So someone who is teaching in a school of architecture or department of architecture, that could be at a university, and teaching at a level where they are considered to be the studio master, meaning the person who leads the studio, you will find that there need to be the most crucial skill that the person will need to have. And that has nothing to do whether they have part one, part two, part three, or a PhD, or 5 years or more experience. It doesn't mean that if you have all that, you qualify to be a studio master. Now, this is my argument. I did write before with regard to three types of people needed in the studio. And I based it first on a design thesis or the final year studio, which is you need to have a coach, you need to have a consultant, and you need to have an expert. Whatever happens in the final year, if you have that sort of expertise, when you go to the lower years, the first year, second year, third year, there also need to be an expert depending on the topic, depending on the theme that is happening with the studio program. You do need a consultant in a way, critique, or even the lecturers who are full-time to actually be a consultant to the design problem. And then you will have more of a coach. And in that coach is someone who actually sees the expectations of the grading or the criteria for grading the work at the end of the semester, and how you would see the student progress day by day, week by week, and you would be able to coach the student so that they are up to speed with the design. So there are these three basic things that happen, and it could happen in one person, it could happen in 2%, 3%, 4 or 5 persons that makes for the team, that make up the team of studio masters or studio master and the 4 studio tutors. I'd like to say that everybody in that studio, teaching and guiding and being a consultant, is a studio master. Because the word master is something traditional, isn't it? Where there is a master and an apprentice. And technically, they are masters themselves. So when certain accreditation body, with regard to a discussion that has came out recently on social media, doing an accreditation handbook, guide, or manual to assist School of Architecture in Malaysia by the Board of Architects. This proposition in the appendix says that qualifying attributes of a design studio master, and they listed it. So this is where we're coming from with regard to what I would like to talk about. Now, I don't like to go and, shall we say, go into the the detail of this, partly because I wasn't involved in this documentation, nor I had any say or feedback or give any feedback to this documentation, nor I was invited to participate in it. But I would like to comment as a former academic with 28 years experience in two universities, one UTM and one University Malaya, which I retired in 2022. With someone who talk about architecture education frequently on this podcast and able to actually garner interest worldwide, I would like to defocus to from Malaysia to look at the global issues or more of what's happening beyond Malaysian shores. But of course, I would do so in the very near future. In fact, I've done with a few, but this means that I am going to actually phase out any, shall we say, concentration on the Malaysian case studies. I think I have the right to comment because as someone who has been in academia and works as the studio master for very many years. In fact, out of the 25 years I've worked as the studio master out of the 28 years, including UTM, I've worked as the studio master for perhaps 26 years. Now, that's a very long time to be a studio master, meaning the definition. I'm looking at the definition of what the Malaysian Board of Architects had proposed in the PPAAP documentation, that the studio master is the one that lead the studio. So it also can be a co-lead. I have done co-lead in a studio with someone who may not necessarily qualify in a way that demands being qualified now. Co-lead, meaning you could argue that the person who assisted in being a studio master had a lot to do with the studio program. The person, you would know the person who is also in talk architecture. I have interviewed the person, and many episodes were one of the best downloaded episodes in talk architecture. In fact, this person is a real master, attested by the ex-students who were with him and many others, because this person actually became a visiting lecturer or professor to many other places in Canada, in America, United States of America, in Europe, in Indonesia, in Asia, in Singapore, and also in India. And that person do not have a Part 3, shall we say, Malaysian Board of Architects qualification, because that person is not an academic. So therefore, this co-leading or collaboration between two persons, because as the full-time academic, I would interpret for the students and interpret the design studio program to the school, in which there have been no disagreement from the school on how I conducted it and how I managed to make a good program collaborating with the person involved. So back to this qualification of being a design studio master. Now, let me just now concentrate on what I think and not so much of this documentation or requirement that is asked. Let me just focus on what I think. I mentioned about the coach, consultant, and expert needing in a design thesis studio, and similarly in the other studios. So what I want to say is that the coach or the characteristic of a coach if the best is everyone in the studio tutor stroke master team need to be a coach, because they need to actually understand the program. Whether they are the one that pushes the student in terms of the directive in the studio, which usually the full-time academic does, is something else. Because those who are doing it part-time, they would say to the student, I guess it's kind of late, isn't it? You're not coming up with a scheme yet. Or, even that, they would say, okay, you can still work this out. But they give a sense of how the progress is going on for the design. So then we have the expert, who could be, I am an expert on accessibility and universal design. For example, we can bring in other tutors or experts from the industry with regard to the other different issues to make the complexity of the design much more in-depth in terms of the advancing the design process, like environmental science, structural design, sustainability ideas, or something to do with detail, and maybe it's a social science expert on maybe to do with Aboriginal studies, or children in primary school or in kindergarten. The expert can come in at a certain point to help with giving advice to the design. Then you have the consultant, which is everyone could be a consultant who has the knowledge of design and usually architectural design process. So we have in our department persons who are good and who are experts in acoustic, and they don't have a background in architectural design. So these persons will come in as experts, and they do, shall we say, administrative jobs in the faculty. So now, going back into this, what makes a good design studio master, is this point where if you're the one organizing the studio program and you happen to be the full-time academic, you need to actually envision or write out in detail as well what happens every week. And you need to work out what dates you will have the interim crits or the group crits, the internal group crit that you have with the studio tutor and master team, the external interim crit, which you invite people from the industry who form the panel for assessment and feedback on the design, perhaps 3 to 4 times in a semester, including the final assessment. And then you will have, shall we say, the individual crits that the student go to the different tutors to go through the design with a desk crit. So there's a variety of crits, and some people call it jury or review in, shall we say, different schools of architecture throughout the world. But I'm just going to give a general idea that is a crit. And then during this crit, the coach, especially the full-time academic, not only facilitate the whole program and especially the crits, they also need to give summaries and feedback to the students. And that's only fair because they have been working hard, and then especially the summative assessment, which is at the end. So when in learning outcomes and learning processes, we have the formative assessment and we have the summative assessment. So obviously, to any endeavor, may it be a dissertation or a report or an essay or a design. So the students of architecture could get formative assessment with the design studio master, and really need to have an assessment at the end with the design studio master in terms of the summative assessment. When you give a grade to the student like an A, B, or C, in the master's course, B is the passing grade and B minus is failure. So you need to explain to the student of architecture what they did right in terms of the assessment. Give them a honest and fair review of what has transpired and explain the feedback from the different critiques. The design studio master, in doing so, actually assists with how the student at that point, they will realize they could do better next semester if they have the chance. And that is something that is part of the teaching process, a teaching and learning process, obviously, where someone is facilitating during the interim crit or during the crits, they moderate sometimes because they have to be the one that moderate, and other people need to be moderating as well, shall we say, the team. But facilitating this process of learning is something that the design studio master need to do. So if you're aware of this skills that is needed, it comes from an awareness, it comes from a sense of duty, it comes from knowing the process well, it comes from the ability to foresee things. They also need to present to the department like a report at the end of the semester on how it has been conducted. As I see it, you don't need a PhD for that. I mean, if you're having a master's and you're quite sufficiently, shall we say, knowledgeable in this, you would be able to do this. And if you're someone who's been around, you don't need a part 3 to do this, obviously, because as we know, part 3 is something to do with a licensing architect. And it has to do with contracts, of course, and much of the design thesis or the design projects don't deal with contracts. I've said elsewhere in my previous podcast that, shall we say, okay, that's another point before that. But I did in my previous podcast gave a suggestion that we need to do architecture course 3 years. You can do the architecture course with 2 years. Bits of courses like professional practice and also do the practical training, and you can get an architect to have a license by 5 years since they first start in the degree. So I did propose that, and because RIBA as well had that discussion. Now, there is this point about, I have to actually go back here. If an academician does not have PhD, they can't lead a design studio at all. Such a shame, because there's so much resource out there. People who are so talented that do not have a PhD and they can lead a design studio, who is an academician. So I don't know where this come from, this criteria. It could be explained further, I suppose, because it's out there for discussion. And also says here that in order to lead part 2, a practicing graduate architect must teach part 1 design studio for at least 5 years. So that's more to do with the experience. So the School of Architecture wanted the Malaysian Board of Architects to solve problems for them. They did not want to argue with their own internal conflicts or internal department matters. They just want to show, look, here is the procedures. We got to follow this procedure, because if we don't, we're not going to get validated at the end of the year or a certain time of the year. So we got to follow this, and please don't argue. I think it's kind of like not open to discussion, and they don't want like an up and coming young graduate architect who barely came in and want to go and teach in part two. So, perhaps there are such problems before, I don't know. But then the third one is, if you have gotten part three without the 5 years experience to lead a studio, and must still have 5 years industry experience before teaching design studio. So you don't want these young people who just graduated to suddenly go and lead a design studio, do you? And you got so if you don't have, you have a part three and you don't have the 5 years experience, you have to go and just wait around, and I don't know, you have to have a 5 years industry experience, and then only you can be considered, because then you will be be considered a good designer, and therefore you can lead a studio. So my argument is, no, it's not. A designer is one thing. A good designer, the definition of a good designer is one thing. So we can even go into that part of discussion now. What is a good designer? So one thing is, when the students do design and they come to you, and then you would design for them. Literally, they come to you and you would do scribbles. And they will love it because they can follow your scribbles. And sometimes in their portfolio sketchbook, they would even show the scribbles or the doodles or the diagrams of the tutor. And they think that is great because they will pass. No, 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 no. That is not the way to learn. Because I had learned the hard way. That is not the way to learn. Students of architecture, if they do, shall we say, copy works, they would copy the works, or they would create something that is like the work of others, and they would, shall we say, didn't come up with that diagram. Somebody else did, and they used that as their own. Sorry to say that this is like the biggest sin, or the biggest bad thing you could do to a student. I mean, I've done that before, and I know that the student struggle with doing a design, of becoming a designer. Now, if you're saying a good designer is that and they qualify to be a design tutor, there are two things here. One is a teacher and one is a designer. You could be a good designer, but you can be a lousy teacher. So a good teacher who happens to be a good designer is someone who can inspire the students or get the student to understand the concept that they conjured with, or the diagrams that they conjured with, or can get them to read something or get them to explore something. They are a teacher, because a teacher in architecture is rare. And then perhaps if people were to actually look forward to be a teacher in architecture and come to the point where they are so good at it, but they don't have all these things like a PhD, for example, or they it's such a shame, because you're not really using the people with the intelligence and the skill of being a teacher. And it defeats the purpose when we have so much bureaucracy being done with regard to architecture education, and it's not helping to me, rather than helping the, shall we say, the School of Architecture. Just because you don't want to argue with your lecturers, or other people, you don't want people to argue, and you're the head of department, you can just show the documentation. It is such a travesty of the spirit of learning and teaching architecture. So we have regressed. We have regressed and backtracked, and we are losing in terms of architecture education. So with that, I am quite open now in criticizing this documentation. And I'm doing it in a podcast here so that I like to open it to other countries, people in different, when you do in your admin stuff, or when you're doing a recognition or a validation program, and what are the criteria when you talk about recommendation. So suggestions, because people will use these things to justify, shall we say, the ends. And what ends is that? We don't know, because it is not a good thing for architectural education for sure. So I didn't really want to concentrate back on this. I don't want to end with a note like that, but I would like to end with the criteria of being a good design studio master is basically the whole vision, the whole collaboration, knowing how to get people to collaborate, and knowing what the student need. And that collaborative skill, or that skill of facilitation, everybody can moderate. Facilitation, you give one person to facilitate and coordinate and organize. And then another thing is to get those people to, shall we say, give them. I mean, it's up to the talents. Different individuals have the talent to teach, so they will learn what is a good teaching talent. How to look into guiding students. They will know what talents they need to have to do. A bit of work there. So people progress and people learn. They became better teachers. Not necessarily everyone wants to do that, because it'll be a shame really if you're just ticking the boxes and ask the student, show me this, and they didn't show, but you're not really concerned about their learning. So it's a travesty of education, the right kind of education. So there you go. What we learned today is the problem with bureaucracy in universities, and how schools of architecture trying to negotiate that in a bad way or in a regressing way. And we have here what makes a good studio master, and shall we say theoretically, and what we've seen so far as we had encountered what it makes a good studio master. And that's the first criteria is teaching, the ability to teach. And if they are good designers, what is a good designer, right? So thank you very much. I hope that explains a bit more. And if you want more explanation, do contact me. Thank you very much.